I don't want to assume that anyone has read anything just yet, or really that anybody knows much about what I'm going to be talking about. So when I say I'm going to put the women of Egyptology in their place, it's really going to be their proper place. I'm not going to be reading from the book. I'm not going to be retelling the book necessarily, but I'm going to talk a little bit about how this book came to be, a little bit of the journey through this, the path that I've been on to write this book. And then after that, I'm going to open it up for questions, and we can have a wonderful conversation.
Should I get the lights?
Oh, sure. Yeah, if you'd like. There we go. All right. So I went, my undergraduate degree is in anthropology from Truman State University, which is a tiny little liberal arts school in northern Missouri. And so actually I was telling Leah when we were walking down here, like I know more probably about anthropology guys from UC Berkeley than I do anything else from Berkeley. And then I decided I wanted to do Egyptian archaeology. So I went to University College London and I got a master's degree there. But I am not a digger. I did not want to go into the field and dig. I need my Starbies in the morning. It's just too far out there. But I knew I wanted to continue to be in the field in some way. And so when I moved back to the United States, I sort of discovered history of science. And what the history of science is kind of, what it says. You look at the development of science over time. And so I went to the University of Oklahoma to first do a master's degree to see if I could even talk about the history of Egyptology. How does one talk about the history of Egyptology? What do you do? And so I started looking at an Egyptologist named Flinders Petrie, and I wrote my master's thesis on his work in eugenics. And I found this because I dove into the archives with absolutely no idea of what I was going to find. And eugenics is basically the science of improving human stock. That's really the best way to say it. Either through encouraging judicious mating, right, which is getting the right people, quote unquote, to reproduce, or discouraging non-judicious mating, or making sure that the wrong people don't reproduce. Petrie was a central figure in this in the late 19th century, and nobody had really looked at his involvement in that before, and so I said, let's go. And as I was looking through, and as I was doing my research for that, I was reading his autobiography called 70 Years in Archaeology, and I found this dedication. We know this one, don't we? To my wife, on whose toil most of my work has depended. Who's his wife? He hardly goes on to name her in the book. He might use her name once or twice in his autobiography, which is about his entire life in Egyptology, 70 years. So who was she? If she toiled so much, and he accomplished so much because of that, who is she? What did she do? Can I even find out anything about her, and why doesn't she get a name? In his site reports, which are the reports, they're scientific reports after each field season, he would always talk about the work his wife did. He'd say, my wife did this, my wife did that, but never actually use her name. And she was doing some really groundbreaking stuff in the field. She was finding really important sites. She was copying important tombs. She was doing a ton of work, and we're about to see this again. But as I kept reading, I'm like, all right, who is she? I'm going to sort of write that down, but I'm still working on Petrie. And then I get to page 199 of his autobiography. And he talks about November 19th, we were off. They actually had gotten delayed because of a cholera outbreak. And so they had to wait until that was over. But they got to Cairo on the 26th. So we've got some last names of men here. And they always get a first name, last name, at least on their first mention. So we've got Arthur Weigel, who he's talking about. I believe this is, I forget this guy's first name. Edward Ayrton, Hugh Stannis, of course. Rawnsley is Noel Rawnsley. So we know those names. But then we have Miss Hansard, who gets another mention as Mrs. Firth, because she ended up marrying a guy named Cecil Firth, who was an Egyptologist. We get Miss Murray, and then we get Miss Eckenstein. And I wondered, okay, who is this Miss Murray, his colleague, who came to help with the Assyrians? So his wife doesn't get a name. All of these other guys, We know who they are because they're men in Egyptology, but he's mentioning this woman as a colleague. She doesn't get a first name, but she gets some equality by being a colleague. So I sort of put her away, put a pin in her, and finished my master's thesis on Petrie. And so I wanted to know who she was. She was mentioned once in his entire 70-year autobiography. And so I thought, who is she? Can I find out anything about her? If his wife did so much work, what did Miss Murray do? And what is the Assyrian? Miss Eckenstein was a woman named Lena Eckenstein, and she was a feminist and a suffragist. She's pretty famous, but Miss Murray was difficult to find. I started doing some Googling, as you do when it's 2005. Her Wikipedia page was only about her work in witchcraft. She was indeed a practicing witch. But what else was she doing? So I found out that this is Margaret Alice Murray here. This is her autobiography. She lived for 100 years. Take note, she was not married and she had no children. So just throwing that out there. She worked with Petrie, according to her autobiography, from the time she got to University College London in 1894 until he died in 1942. So that's almost 50 years of working with someone as first his student, then as his colleague, then as a field worker, and then she took over as the educator in charge of the department. And she did this work side by side with him for 40 years. And so she got half a sentence in his autobiography. He got an entire chapter in hers. And so I thought, why don't I write about her? Why don't we see what else she did? She did some witchcraft. She did a number of other things. This is an image here of her unwrapping mummified remains in Manchester, in England. She unwrapped two mummified people in Manchester. She was the last person to do that publicly, and she published a scientific report on them about Middle Kingdom mummification. And so I wrote my dissertation on her, and I thought, man, if I can write, and then it became my first book, if I can write a 250-page PhD dissertation on a woman who got half a sentence in his autobiography, what else are we missing? Who else is getting a half a sentence, and we are missing an entire life? So I wanted to understand that. I wanted to know who else had been erased, and who we could learn about. So you never know what you're going to find in archives. When I started working on Flinders Petrie, I just kind of went in not knowing what to even look for. And I just waited for the archive to tell me the story. And it told me this really horrible story about a racist eugenicist. And then when I dove in to the archives about Margaret Murray, first of all, I found her handwriting was much easier to read, which makes it much nicer to do your work. And I found out, again, that she had become a teacher of hieroglyphs. She trained most of the Egyptologists that came through the department for about 30 years. I'm going to talk about several of her students today. She taught at Cambridge, she went to Manchester, she sort of went all over the place. And so I wanted to sort of keep working. And I started to then work on this project about hotels, which my idea was that hotels are places of knowledge creation, where Egyptologists would meet each other to talk and trade ideas, and they would drink tea, of course, or things that are stronger. So if I'm going to figure out what they're talking about privately, this isn't going to be stuff that's really showing up in the public record, or in publications. And so I started looking at diaries, journals, letters, memoirs, all of these things. So I had to go to the archives. Archives. I went to as many as I possibly could to pull out as much material as I possibly could. I still have probably thousands of pages I haven't looked at, but I have images of. So this is where you go to find the people who don't show up in the histories that you normally read. So I went to the British Museum archives. This is Margaret Murray's handwriting here. As you can see, it is just delightful. And so anytime I find her in an archive anymore, I immediately know her handwriting, and I'm just always excited to see it. She has a special place in my heart. But so here you see she wrote to Dr. Budge. This is Wallace Budge. All the letters to him are basically in the British Museum archives because that's where he worked for so long, right? But there are so few archives that are centers of women's letters, centers of women's, that are repositories of women's materials. There are some. So the Egypt Exploration Society has a bunch of Amelia Edwards letters, which makes sense because Amelia Edwards founded the Egypt Exploration Society. University College London has a ton of Margaret Murray stuff because she was there for 40 years. But in general, women's stuff is scattered. So I had to go looking even more. This is in the Egypt Exploration Society reading room where I started, again, looking for a lot of these women. And the thing is, they're there. Their stuff is there. You have to sort through everything. And I'm going to talk a lot about that. I had to go to the Garstang archives at the Garstang Museum in Liverpool, which was absolutely fascinating. I had not known a whole lot about Garstang at that point. They have some Agatha Christie stuff in here, where she's actually writing as Agatha Mallowan because she had married Max Mallowan, who was the Egyptologist. And then I went to the Griffith Institute in Oxford, and they have Percy Newberry's correspondence that is extremely well organized, thank goodness. And then Alan Gardner's correspondence, which is not as well organized just yet, but they're getting there. I love this image because it's photographs of Egyptologists. They've got photographs of Egyptologists from like 1860 until about 1970, and they are just amazing. And the archivists at all of these places are the real experts on these people, right? Because you sort of say, I'm looking for this, but I don't really know what I'm looking for. And then you go away for a coffee break and you come back and you have boxes and boxes of stuff. Like this. This is at it's now the Institute for the Study of Ancient Cultures. It used to be the Oriental Institute at the University of Chicago, where James Breasted's archives are. James Henry Breasted is one of the first American Egyptologists, and he started the department at the University of Chicago. So that's where all of his correspondence is. And then they'll stick you in this room to look at all of it. So yeah, going to these and more, right? But the main ones that I focused on were Oxford, Chicago, and the Egypt Exploration Society. I didn't find them in order, right? I did not find these women in chronological order. I didn't find, Amelia Edwards first and then move on to Maggie Benson and Nettie Gourlay. I found them sort of scatterbrained. But again, I'm still working on this other project, so I'm not really thinking about women in Egyptology just yet. I am, because that's my main focus, but I had a different story to tell. But when I was at the University of Chicago archives looking for stuff, where did James Breasted stay? Everywhere. He had Rockefeller money. Like, he could do whatever he wanted to. But I found this woman here. This is Caroline Ransom Williams. She was Caroline Ransom for most of her life. So I found her, and as I was looking through the archives, it's great the way they have them organized. They have all of his correspondence organized by office correspondence or field correspondence, and then they organize it by year, and in each year box they have different file folders for different letters of last names. When I found Caroline Ransom, she was in the L's for 1898 for Lake Erie Seminary, because that's where she was writing from. So she wasn't even like a person. She just came from an institution, and they put her in this box. And then she wrote this letter. This was her first letter to him in January of 1898. And it is her earnest desire to pursue during the year 1898 to 1899 in the University of Chicago such studies as will best fit me for original investigation in regard to the development of ancient art. And so she's writing to him saying, can I come? And do you have a scholarship for me? Because I could really use one. And he wrote back to her and said, yeah, absolutely, come, please join us. We're going to set you up. She already had Frank Tarbell's approval. He was a classicist. And so she ended up, and she wanted to take her minor work in Egyptology, and she wanted to go as a master's student and work with Breasted and Tarbell. And so she shows up. She goes to the University of Chicago, and she finishes her master's degree by 1901. She goes off to Berlin to study with Adolf Ehrman, and then she finishes her PhD under Tarbell and Breasted in 1905. She's the first American woman Egyptologist with a PhD. She then, after a couple of more letters, by 1899, her letters show up in the R's for ransom. And here she is. This is from the Bryn Mawr yearbook in 1908. And then once she gets married in 1916, she starts showing up in the W's, not for Dr. Ransom, but for Mrs. Williams. And so not only do you sort of have to find these women first, you have to chase them down through last names, through different jobs, through different things that they wanted to do. So what I found here, I sort of set the hotel book off to the side for a little bit, and I realized that she and James Breasted wrote back and forth to each other for almost 40 years. James Breasted died of a strep infection in his throat in 1935, but they had been she had first, again, kind of like Margaret Murray with Flinders Petrie, been his student, and then his colleague, and then they shared letters back and forth throughout her entire career. And it's because of these letters, here she is right here. She brought her mother with her for one season. There's James Breasted here. There's Alan Gardner. It's not a super clear picture. So after she finished her PhD, she went to Bryn Mawr to teach for a few years. She got tired of teaching. She was teaching like 5 classes a year. She was the department chair. She was tired. She went to the Metropolitan Museum of Art as its first woman curator of Egyptian art in 1910, and then she worked there until 1916 when she got married. She was 42 when she got married to a guy back home in Toledo. But the reason that we know all of this is not because she left any journals, because I have not been able to find any journals. It's because of these letters back and forth to her professor, right, and friend, that we know anything about her. There are letters in the Metropolitan Museum of Art because she was a curator there, but the only reason I knew there should be was because I knew that she had gone there through her letters. So, again, you know, finding women in these places. And one person who had been working on James Breasted emailed me when they found out I was working on this, and they basically said, this is pointless. We don't need to know anything about her. She's not actually that important. So I held that, I treasured that in my heart, and I decided maybe it's time. Maybe it's time that we actually do learn something about her. So I published this with Archaeo Press, I think in 2018. But they're all her letters, right, that we have between her and James Breasted. And that's pretty much, I mean, a majority of them. So when I found out she had gone to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, I thought, I'm going to go find her there. And so I did. I went and found letters between her and several Egyptologists, because in the 6 years she was at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, she was the one who stayed in New York while Alfred Lithgow and Herbert Winlock, who were the other curators, went out to the field. And they sent artifacts back to her in boxes and boxes and boxes. And so she got these boxes and she opened up the boxes. And she did the research on the pieces, put them on display, put on exhibits, wrote the books about the exhibits, and made sure that the museum, department was running. In 1913, Albert Lithgow sent back 601 boxes of massive stones from a temple, a tomb, the Masaba tomb of Perneb. And if you've ever been to the Metropolitan Museum of Art and you stand in the great entrance hall and you look to the right, that's what you see. She rebuilt that tomb inside the museum. first she had to figure out how to preserve the stones, because the salt in this particular stone doesn't really activate until it gets humid. It's not humid in Egypt, and so it came to New York, and she had to figure out, what do we do? Do we soak all the stones so that the salt dissolves, or do we paint them? She painted them, because if you soak all the stones, all the original paint comes off. So they had to sort of shellac the stones, basically. But then she rebuilt the tomb, and it opened in 1916 in February. And she wrote a best-selling book about this entire process. So, but we don't know that much about her, right? She's not that important, according to this one guy. So I go to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, I find her a little bit more, and then I also find these diaries that are kept in the Metropolitan Museum of Art by this woman named Emma Andrews. She had traveled with Theodore Davis in Egypt for 25 years, right? At first I started looking at these Caroline Ransom Williams letters, and there were some, but then I found these diaries and just honestly dove right into those. Now, they do talk about hotels in here, so they are an absolute treasure trove. But also, who is this lady? This is what I wanted to find out. So this is a copy of the book plate that was given to Albert Lithgow in 1918. And I am dying to know what other books were on that boat. I have not been able to figure it out yet. But who is she? She was an American millionaire who she had been married, but her husband died. And her cousin, Annie, was married to Theodore Davis. That's how the two of them met. Well, Emma Andrews and Theodore Davis fell in love. Annie got kicked out of the Newport mansion. Emma Andrews moved in, and they traveled up and down the Nile together for 25 years, happy as clams. They had a blast. Annie came a couple of times, but it was tense. That was a really tense time. So from 1890 or so until about 1900, they traveled for 10 years. They're rich, okay? They've got their own boat. They're traveling in Egypt for 6 months out of the year. They're buying antiquities. They're just being tourists. They're running around. They are, doing some patronage of schools and churches and things like that. They're bringing their family with them. But by about 1900, they were like, we've bought enough antiquities. Let's start, supporting some excavations. Wouldn't that be fun? So this guy named Percy Newberry of the Newberry Correspondence at the Griffith Institute, he wrote to them and said, listen, my patron is about to stop giving me money. Can you guys help me? And Emma actually wrote him back and said, yes. Theodore and I will split the amount, but we're going to support your next year of excavation. And so Newberry got to do that. And as far as I know, she paid half for that first season. She also paid for a second season on her own for Newberry. And I think, personally, that she paid for at least half of the following seasons because she had the money. It is something that she liked to do. But as a patron, she never really got the credit. Theodore Davis was the one who got all of the credit for all of these excavations. And so Albert Lithgow writes this note in front of her 25 years full of diaries, and I love to read it. So he says, while on her way through New York in the autumn of 1916, Mrs. Andrews kindly gave her consent to a request which I made, that we be allowed to copy this journal of her life on the Nile, primarily in order that we might have on record in the Egyptian department of the museum the many facts which it contains relating to the archaeological work of Theodore M. Davis, from results of which the museum has received such valuable material through his various gifts and under the terms of his will. They got a ton of his stuff. I think they got all of his Egyptian stuff, some of his European stuff. If you ever get to go to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, look at those labels. It'll say Theodore Davis, but not Emma Andrews. As a member of his family, Mrs. Andrews accompanied Mr. Davis, as a member of his family, on his annual visits to Egypt for a period of more than 20 years. And the charming description which she gives of their river life on the Bedouin, familiar to many of us who enjoyed their hospitality, is certainly worthy of a wider public, and more permanent form imprint, though she could not be prevailed upon to consider this. So he said, hey, can we have your handwritten stuff? We'll type them up and we'll give them back to you. But I love the contrast here. So we're recording the many facts which are relative to the archaeological work of Theodore Davis. But then Andrews gives a charming description, right? So they get to pull the right facts, but really it's just a charming description. So it depends on whose work you're talking about here, right? Davis did archaeological work. She wrote charming descriptions, except for the fact that Davis pulled all of his site report recording from her diaries. She wrote out maps. She recorded maps of tombs. She wrote, here is everything that we found. Here's how big the sarcophagus was. Here's who came. Here's who were the first people inside the tomb. Weigel got angry because we let everybody in and we weren't supposed to. This lady fell off of her donkey chair. She rolled out of a donkey chair onto the ground. Her husband really got mad about that. She wrote the best and most interesting stuff. But Davis pulled all of his information for his site reports from her diaries, right? So the records that she's keeping were of her own archaeological work as well. So this sort of tipped me off at the beginning that these are sources, right, that are written by women that we pull historical information from without actually looking at the people who are writing it, right? Because these are the types of records that women are going to keep, again, without really getting much of the credit for keeping these records. And that's what happens on excavation and things like this. So again, I think that the evidence shows that Lithgow is wrong about this. There are several charming descriptions. But I think more than that, this is an important archaeological memoir that Andrews should be recognized for. All of these images are courtesy of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Then, after that, I went to Oxford to go to the Griffith Institute. And I was looking for letters again. I was looking for the ones from Emma Andrews. I was looking for Caroline Ransom Williams. I was looking for Margaret Murray, because I always look for Margaret Murray. And I was looking for all of these people who stayed at hotels. What were they talking about? Where were they going? And I had known about Kate Bradbury for quite some time. But I found a lot of her letters that were at the Griffith Institute, especially having to do with Amelia Edwards. So Kate Bradbury Griffith had been Amelia Edwards' companion on a 6-month-long lecture tour of the United States from 1889 to 1890. And her travel journal is at the Griffith Institute. And this is one volume, and it's about 2 inches thick. It's typewritten. There are a lot of photographs and things like that that are sort of inserted in there. She kept all the souvenirs. But it is a record of every day of this 6-month journey where Amelia Edwards gave over 100 lectures throughout the northern United States over the very cold winter, actually. She talks a lot about the weather in there. But again, it's because of these journals that we know about this scientific lecture tour that Amelia Edwards went on, and how she truly and deeply impacted American Egyptology. And I hate to say things like, without this we wouldn't know, because we can't actually prove that, but we do know that because we have these journals, we have a very good and clear and concise record of what they were doing. And then letters between Kate Bradbury and Amelia Edwards were all part of this archive as well. And Kate Bradbury was her assistant when they were setting up the Egypt Exploration Society when they were running it from 1887 is when Kate joined up until Amelia Edwards' death in 1892. And then she continued this work for the next 10 years. She ended up getting married in 1896 to Francis Llewellyn Griffith, who was balding hieroglyphics teacher from University College London. He was destitute. He had no money of his own. He had a giant crush on her from the moment he met her. She had no idea. Flinders Petrie actually had to like elbow her a little bit and be like, you know, he thinks you're pretty cute. She's like, what? So they ended up getting married, and I was sort of finishing up some stuff, and I thought, I'm going to Google her one more time and see if I missed anything, and I did. She has family letters at the University of Kansas, which in Midwestern terms is right up the road from where I am. It's about 7 hours away. We know how that goes. But they were able to digitize all of them and send them to me. And she had been writing letters to her cousin who lived in Kansas City, Missouri. And she sort of, when she was in her 20s, she was kind of saying, congratulations on your engagement. I don't know why anyone would want to get married. That's not really my thing. I feel like if I get married, it's going to sort of like kill all of my interests and all of my work. I'm not going to get anything done. I'm just going to be bothered all the time, but I'm really happy for you. And then her cousin got married, and I don't know. But then she met Frank Griffith, and her letters started changing. She's like, oh, so I met this guy, and she's like, he's a great match for me. We have the same goals. Here's what we're going to do. And then after she got married, she wrote to her aunt that he's very good to look upon, and I'm not the only one who thinks so. Oh, right? I know. She's like, he's cute, and that's what everybody says. And she was right. And then they worked together for the next 6 years. She loved it. They would get up in the morning, they would have tea, and they would work together all day. This was her childhood dream. And she died from, I think it's not really clear what it was, but I think it was some sort of appendicitis sort of attack. I know, and she had surgery, and then she never fully recovered from the surgery, and then she died. And he was bereft. He couldn't really operate. He ended up living with her father until her father died, and then he got all of their money. They were Manchester cotton mill millionaires, right? He got all of the Griffith money, and then married another very wealthy woman named Nora Cobbin Griffith. And once he died, she took all of her money plus his leftover money and started the Griffith Institute at Oxford University. So I would argue, although I haven't done this in writing, that it should be the Bradbury Cobbin Institute and maybe not the Griffith Institute. But I think I would maybe be canceled for that. So I guess it's just going to go online, but I'm not putting it in writing. But again, so she was instrumental in keeping the Egypt Exploration Society running. It is still a society, keeping it running after its founder had died. She set up the new department at University College London according to Amelia Edwards' will, so that Flinders Petrie could be the first chair of it, so that then Margaret Murray shows up a few years later, and British Egyptology is sort of set. Kate Bradbury is central to this entire operation, and it is because of the fact that she was a continuous presence that it survived. But again, she sort of gets subsumed under Frank, which was her nightmare. But she did, and now we can sort of go into the archives and pull out all of this information about her. Because these women are doing the writing. Everybody who was in Egyptology would have known who these women were. But they're not the ones who are doing the publications for the most part. And so they're not getting the historical credit for it, which is really difficult. So a few more women. This is Jenny Lane. Jenny Lane was the lady's maid of Amelia Edwards and Lucy Renshaw when they were traveling in Egypt from 1873 to 1874. And again, like I said, I'm not finding these women chronologically, so you're going with me on this journey. I'm trying to give you some of the dates as we go, but this is sort of the start, right? Amelia Edwards' 1,000 Miles Up the Nile that she published in 1878 was based on the trip that she took with Lucy Renshaw, Marianne Brocklehurst, Mary Booth, and then Jenny Lane was their maid, basically. Dates are difficult for her. There's like a 5-year window for her birth, about the same for her marriage. I think she got married twice. I don't think she had any children. But on this journey up the Nile in 1873 to 74, it wasn't just Amelia Edwards who wrote a diary. Jenny Lane did too. And they ended up in family hands, and the Egypt Exploration Society won the auction to have them. They have fully digitized them, and they're up online. And you can follow through day by day of what they were doing. And Lane talks about very different things than Amelia Edwards did. Or sometimes she changes the story. Her narrative is like a different window on it. Famously, Amelia Edwards said, oh, it takes 4 hours a day. It took us 10 days at 4 hours a day to pick out our boat. It's so hard, and it's so lonely out there, and it's dirty. And Jenny Lane was like, so Miss Renshaw picked out a boat in like 3 days. We're ready to go. Like, everything's fine. So the narratives are quite different, which I find absolutely fascinating. And then you've got Mary Ann Brocklehurst. She was a very wealthy woman from, again, a northern cotton mill family. They started out in buttons, but then they found out that the money was in cotton. And then her partner, Mary Booth, they were so passionately in love with each other that Brocklehurst's sister wrote in a letter to a friend that she was envious of the relationship that her sister had with Mary Booth, and she wanted that for herself because they just loved each other. They were so perfect for each other, and they just followed each other around doing the things that they wanted to do together. So they went on this trip with Amelia Edwards as well, and Mary Ann Brocklehurst kept a diary of this journey. So we have 3 different takes on one trip, which allows us different windows into different activities and things that they're seeing. This is Lucy Renshaw. She was actually, we think, was Amelia Edwards' partner at the time. Amelia Edwards was, she was very passionately in love with a lot of women throughout her life. She was sort of known for it. And this was a woman that she was with for several years, and they traveled around a lot together. Now, I'm interested in her. She was pretty rich, and every time they stopped at a market, she would buy a nose ring. And I don't know if she had her nose pierced or what, but Jenny Lane was like, oh yeah, Miss L bought another nose ring. I'm like, what is she doing with these? Was she just like walking around with, like, did she have the septum pierced? I want to know. I really need to know this detail. She was very interested in the rings, in the nose rings. But the Lane diaries are at the Griffith. There's Lucy Renshaw's stuff. We don't know where it is because we are not sure sort of what happened to all of her material after she kind of left Amelia Edwards and went back home. We do know that Jenny Lane was her maid, and she and Lane went to Egypt 2 more times together, one time possibly with Mary Ann Brocklehurst and Mary Booth. But Amelia Edwards never went back to Egypt. She only went that one time, and then went home and worked on the Egypt Exploration Society. So again, I'm sort of just finding remnants, right, of these women. Some pictures, sometimes we have no pictures, sometimes we have letters, sometimes we have dates, and just trying to sort of figure out where do they all fit, how do we include them all in the story. And then we've got in the Griffith Institute, again, we have 400 plus letters from Myrtle Broom back to her family over the course of about 7 years that she was working at Abydos with Amos Calverley. They were both artists. Myrtle Broom was trained by Margaret Murray, and this story was really interesting to me because there are 4 volumes of the art of the Temple of Seti I at Abydos that a lot of Egyptologists know about. It's something that Egyptologists depend on, especially if they can't get to Abydos, because it's hard to get there even still. And so there's 4 very well illustrated volumes of art that these 2 women copied from about 1927, I think, to 1936 or 37, something like that. And what happened was, Amos Calverley was working at Oxford. She was doing some copying in the Ashmolean Museum, and she got hired by Alan Gardner, who was working for the Egypt Exploration Society. He said, "We need a copyist." She's like, "Yeah, okay, I'll do it." And she did such good work that when the American Egyptologist James Breasted came to visit with John D. Rockefeller Jr. Rockefeller said, this work is so good, I am going to give 21,000 pounds for this project. And at the time, that was over $1 million in today's money. He said, the one thing that you have to do is keep this woman as the director. I will only give the money if she is the one doing the work. And they were like, deal. Alan Gardner was perfectly fine with it because the Egypt Exploration Society never has any money because they're mostly crowdfunded. They are fantastic, but they are mostly funded from supporters and subscribers. So he said, yes, please. And she was able to bring on Myrtle Broom, who everybody in Egyptology knew was an amazing artist. And so she was brought in for this project. So these two women ran one of the most well-funded projects in Abydos kind of ever because they were that talented. That's why they were hired for the work. And so in the end, they produced 4 volumes of color copies of these temple walls. They're actually available on the Institute for the Study of Ancient Cultures website. They've been digitized and they're absolutely beautiful. There was a 5th volume that I found evidence had gotten all the way to the proof stage, so there should be some paper copies somewhere. But in the 70s, a bunch of the guys who were too busy in Egyptology, they were just never at their desks, just sort of lost track of it and said, welp, that's too bad. So the project sort of ended in the 70s with a 5th volume that was never published. And those volumes are so well done, they're too expensive to reproduce at this point. It would be too expensive, no one would be able to buy them. We have, again, all of this evidence because of these letters at the Griffith Institute, right? We've got some written stuff from Alan Gardner. We have some letters with James Breasted. Amos Calverley wrote some back and forth to the Egypt Exploration Society, to the secretaries there. But the crux, the meat of this story is in the letters that Myrtle Broom wrote back to her parents. And that are digitized and they're up online with the Griffith Institute. This is the story, right? Let's get these things out there so people can know these stories and tell them. So again, it's because of the records women were keeping that we know anything about them. So who was Amos writing back to? She was writing back to this woman, Mary Jonas. Okay, here's Amos here. Here is Myrtle Broom. Mary Jonas was the secretary of the Egypt Exploration Society from 1919 until 1939. And she had taken over from Emily Patterson, who had been Amelia Edwards' personal secretary from 1887. And then she remained with the Egypt Exploration Society until 1919. So we have about 30 years of work from Emily Patterson. We have 20 years of secretarial work from Mary Jonas. For 50 years, these women wrote and received letters from every Egyptologist that needed to do any work in Egypt. Everyone who was anyone in Egyptology would have known Mary Jonas and Emily Patterson. We don't have any photographs. We don't have any pictures of Emily Patterson at all. And this is the only picture that we have of Mary Jonas. And this was actually debated for quite some time if it was her or not, because she would be about 50 in this picture. But I ended up getting in touch with her family, her great nephew and great niece, and they have childhood pictures of her. And so they looked at this one, they're like, yeah, we think that's definitely her, and they sent other pictures, and it's definitely her. But so all of the letters, basically all of the secretarial letters are either Patterson or Jonas at the Egypt Exploration Society for 50 straight years. People who are writing histories of Egyptology or who are writing about sites in Egypt have to use these letters as source material. And so they are, right? They're using the information in the letters, but not asking this question of who are the women that are giving this information? Who are the women that know all of this stuff that everyone's depending on for this information? Mary Jonas also did quite a lot of curatorial work. When site cards started coming back, records of artifacts from sites started coming back to the EES, she would fix them, right? She would look at the thing and go, oh, they missed this detail, and so she would fix the cards. for every artifact that came in, she would do a run through, make sure everything was accurate, and then sort of put it away. So she was the one, again, who was taking in all of these artifacts, and then she would put together the distribution of them to museums across the world. So she knew where all of these things were going. She knew everybody and what they wanted. And they were, again, I know I've said it before, but I don't think I can overstate that they were the crux of British Egyptology for 50 years. And again, it's really hard to figure out much information about them. We do our best. And then these two are my favorite. This is Maggie Benson and Nettie Gourlay. They were the first women in Egypt to ever have permission to excavate. They are, I would argue, the definition of a scientific couple. I love the story about this because National Geographic showed this in an exhibit, I don't know, five or 10 years ago, and the label said that they were fast friends. They're just buddies. Yeah, so they were not. They were far more than friends. They were passionately in love. The letters that Maggie Benson wrote to Nettie Gourlay were very explicitly physically affectionate, right? Saying the things that she wanted to do to and with Nettie, and they sent these letters back and forth to each other for years. So they met in 1896. Nettie had been trained by Margaret Alice Murray and Flinders Petrie at University College London. She traveled to Egypt to sort of relieve some of her illness symptoms. That's why Maggie Benson was there. And they met up and they were like, let's excavate together. And so they did. And they did much better work, I think, and they were much more productive together than they would have been apart, because Maggie had the money and Nettie had some money, but she had the training, and so they worked together as equals, right? This was the important thing. Both of their names are on their best-selling site report, the Temple of Mut in Ashur, and this is a district in the Temple of Karnak that hadn't really been excavated before, so they remapped it. They found hundreds, if not thousands, of pieces of statuary, hundreds of statues of a goddess named Sekhmet, and they started to rehabilitate that area. People are still working on it. Betsy Bryan worked on it for a really long time from Johns Hopkins. The American Research Center in Egypt has a mission at the Temple of Mut. All because Maggie Benson wanted to see if there were some more cat statues under that dirt. And she found them. But again, she found them and she knew what was going on because she had a partner who was not only supportive of her work, but knew what was happening. So these are some of the women, right, that I talk about in the book. And, just to sort of let you know that this is not a completely linear process, right? We're trying to put all of these pieces together and ask some of these questions, right, of who gets included in the story and who gets left out. I didn't talk to you really, I didn't have a slide just for Amelia Edwards today for a couple of reasons. One, she is very well known in the discipline of Egyptology. She is in the book, she is the first chapter, but there's so much more to Egyptology than just Amelia Edwards, and there's so much more to women in Egyptology than Amelia Edwards, so I didn't talk about her very much today. This is Lucy Duff Gordon. I have an entire chapter about her, and I just took it out for a couple of reasons. One, she traveled to Egypt, and her legacy was as a travel writer. She was not particularly interested in the antiquities, so I thought it was kind of hanging off. Like, her story was sort of like important. It was tangential. We could have made it work, but I didn't put the whole thing in there. Lucy Duff Gordon's Letters from Egypt, which was a best-selling book, was what brought Amelia Edwards to Egypt. But I did not include her in the book, mainly for that reason. It was just not sort of a main part of the story. And then Nina Degaris Davies. She was an artist. This is her husband, Norman Degaris Davies. They worked together for decades. Leah and I were just in the Egyptology library, and there was a book by Davies, but it didn't say which one. And in fact, when they published, they usually publish under N. Daguerre Davies. And some people sort of say, oh, well, that's cool because they must have been just working together so much that, you know, you can't really sort of say who was doing the most work. I really do honestly think that she was doing more of the writing, she was a wonderful artist, more of the copying and the painting. And Norman wanted some of that credit, right? And so let's publish under N. Daguerre Davies. But it's really difficult to figure out who was doing what. And then there's just not a ton of biographical information on her. So I couldn't really bring her in without it sort of seeming like a listicle, you know what I mean? Like I didn't just want sort of a chapter of, and then there's more. Annie Perry Quibell is here in the plaid. She was a Scottish Egyptologist. She started working with Petrie in 1895, and she and her who ended up being her husband, James Quibell, they met on one of Petrie's sites when they both had food poisoning. Petrie was infamous for not having fresh food, and they both almost died from food poisoning in the Egyptian desert, but they nursed each other back to health. They fell in love and got married. So she worked with her husband, Quibell, Edward Quibell, for the rest of her life as an artist. But again, there's not a ton necessarily out there about her, except some touching stories about, you know, her love for her husband. And then we've got Egyptians. What about Egyptian men and women? Where do they fit in this? Did they even have ideas about the stuff that they were pulling out of the ground? First of all, they were the ones doing most of the hard and heavy lifting, okay? Secondly, yes, they had ideas about the stuff that they were pulling out of the ground. It's their own history. There is a project currently at Harvard with the Kuft diaries, right? The diggers that came from a town called Koptos or Guft, they wrote their own excavation journals in Arabic. And so there is a project to translate a lot of those excavation diaries, and I cannot wait to see what comes out of them because I want to know what they were thinking, especially about the people who were telling them to do all of this work. I couldn't really fit them in the book, not because they're not important, but because the main goal of this book was to talk about the Western practitioners and all of their, you know, sort of warts and all, if you will. But they're very important laborers and thinkers and Egyptologists that come out of Egypt. And then, are these women even important? There was this question I sort of had the whole time I was working. Is there anything more than just, look, here's another cool woman, and look at all the stuff that she did? Yes, there very much is. There is a story of, the stories that I want to tell here are of discipline building, are of ideas, sites, places, histories, and people's lives. I really do think that the story of especially women in Egyptology is a story of love and of loss. And then just, for me, a biographer, I really do think it's in the lives of the people that the world, that the disciplines are made. Those are the people doing the building of these disciplines. And so a lot of the stuff, especially in the book, yeah, it's a ton of Egyptology, but it's very much biographical information about their children and their families and the lives that they led and how did they feel about these people. So to show you, here are some real women in the Valley of the Kings. And yeah, thank you very much. I'll be happy to answer any questions. Yes?
Did you find indications that any of the women you write about were frustrated and found that gender was a barrier to what they wanted to do? And if so, did they strategize about how to get past that barrier?
Yeah, so I got to repeat the question for the online recording. The question is, in the research, did I find that women were frustrated by some of these things, and did they strategize to try and overcome them? Yes, they were extremely frustrated. One of my favorite stories is Margaret Murray on her first day at Abydos. She only went out with Petrie twice, 1902 to 03 and 03 to 04. And when she went to Abydos, she was given 30 minutes of instruction by Petrie. He was like, put your dig pile there. You want to go over here. This is where you're digging. Here's the guys. Go. And then she watched as the students, the male students she had just trained in her own classroom, got 2 straight weeks of close and concerned instruction from Petrie, right? But on that first day, she was smart. I mean, come on. So he's like, here you go do this stuff. So she marches off with an all-male Egyptian crew. And they were like, we're not having this. We're not going to work for this lady. Like, who is she? And so she's like, okay. And she says in her autobiography, she said, I knew that if I tried to work with them or I tried to complain that I wouldn't get any work from them for the entire year or for the entire season. She's like, so I just marched them right back to the professor, who was Petrie. And I just said, well, I think I'm done with them for the day. It was after like 10 minutes. And he's like, what? And she's like, they don't want to work, so they can go home for the day. And these guys were terrified because they were about to lose an entire day's worth of wages, plus bakshish for whatever pieces that they found, because Petrie liked to pay extra if they found pieces. And so they're like, no, we will do the work. And so Petrie was like, okay, if they work for you, will you take it back? She's like, fine. And after that, she didn't have any trouble with them. But very often these women were left to sort of strategize on their own because she was sort of on her own in the field. Maggie Benson got yelled at by a guy named Georges Legrand for some excavation practices that were de rigueur, like everybody did them, but he came up and yelled at her for them. And she didn't know what to do. And so her brother Fred had to sort of come and help her, but it was kind of piecemeal. There wasn't necessarily like all right, ladies, when we go out into the field, here's what we're going to have to do. But they did, I mean, there were, the whisper networks. We all know, most women know about whisper networks. If you're going to go out to the field with Petrie, just know that this is going to happen, and you need to be aware of this and all that kind of stuff. So there was some of that, but mostly it was just like, in the moment, what can you do? I will say that most of these women, all of these women were suffragists. Some of them would march, some of them didn't, but they were all very much for the women's vote. So that was something. Yeah, great question. Did I see that? Yeah.
Just trivial point. You mentioned that Davis used his wife's diary and notes to write his books. I didn't realize that the benefactors of the supporters, the financial people, were in the habit of writing reports. I don't think Carnarvon ever did, but of course he died before anything important happened. But was that practice? Were the benefactors typically writing reports?
So the question is, Emma Andrews kept all of the records for Theodore Davis's excavation, and was it common practice for the patrons to write the reports? So it was common practice for the patron to get some authorship and mention, at least, right, in the report. Davis, much to much to the chagrin of the archaeologists that he actually did work with, he was very hands-on. So because he was the patron, the Department of Antiquities said, we have to assign you an archaeologist. You can't just go and dig anymore. And so he got some good ones. He got Edward Ayrton. He had Quibell for a little while. He had Howard Carter was one of them. And he was just like, well, I'm going to do it too because I'm 65 and I used to hunt in the woods of Michigan and I'm going to help. And so he did. He had his own ideas about things that came out of the ground, and he was frequently incorrect, but those went straight into his site report anyway. So he was sort of like, I'm the one with the money, there's nothing you can really do about it. In fact, he told Gaston Maspero that he was wrong about the identity of the mummified remains that came out of a tomb. And it turned out Davis was wrong, and he screwed up the entire thing, and we're still arguing about it to this day. So,
just wanted to add that in your book, you print the only known plan of Tomb 55, which was drawn by Mrs. Andrews.
Yes, it was.
So I'm assuming that Mrs. Andrews' data underlies what a lot of what is in Davis's reports.
Yes, 100%. So yeah, Emma Andrews wrote the only known map with the placement of all the artifacts in KV 55, and that's what comes in the report. That's what's in, I know, the complete Valley of the Kings, Nicholas Reeves' book about the Valley of the Kings. That's the map that's in there for KV 55. So it's, when you know what women were doing and then you find their records in men's reports, it's really interesting to see, because that map from KV 55, that was, Theodore Davis was given credit for that map in Nicholas Reeves' book, right? So you're sort of tracing this through publication too, and you're going, missed opportunity, Nicholas Reeves. Not that he doesn't do great work, but I'm just saying, like, you know. So yeah, her data absolutely was the crux of everything that Davis wrote, except when it came to the mummified remains coming out of 55.
Right,
That was all Davis. Yeah. Yeah. These are great questions. What else? Yes, sir.
Two questions about Margaret Alice Murray. And you wrote a book about her, so.
I did.
The first one is, was she a language expert? Because I have a copy of her Tubner's classic grammar.
Hers?
I think so.
Her personal copy?
No, I mean a copy.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, so the question is, was Margaret Alice Murray a language expert? Yes, she was. She got to UCL in 1894. By 1898, she had taken over Frank Griffith's hieroglyphics classes, because he was a wonderful linguist. He was not a good teacher. She was a fantastic teacher and a linguist. So she taught most of the script classes from 1898 until 1935. At UCL. So a lot of the notebooks that we have that are Margaret Drower had language classes with Margaret Murray. Emily Patterson had language classes with Margaret Murray. All the students who went through had those classes. Alan Gardner, who I mentioned several times, he dedicated one of his own dictionaries to Margaret Murray, who he first learned hieroglyphics from. And so he gave her that credit. So yeah, she was a very good linguist. And Petrie depended on her because he couldn't read it. Yeah.
Suffragette years, was that later? Did that come later in her career?
Her first march was the Mud March in 1907. So yeah, it was right in the middle of it all. She was also, the question was about Margaret Murray suffrage and if it came later in the year. She was also very kind of quietly disobedient. She did the whole, she ended up getting the women a better common room because they couldn't all fit in the one common room that they had. Like 2 or 3 people could fit at a time. It was a really long, narrow room, and the men sort of had this palatial place. So she invites the provost of University College London for a tea after lunch in the women's common room, and he couldn't, they sat him all the way in the back, and he just sort of watched this farce that they put on. They had planned it, right, to be very, we're spilling all of our stuff, and it was very dramatic, but it was also true. And so the next time they put in for rooms, the women got a much bigger and better common room. So she did stuff like that. That was quietly subversive. I think she joined the Women's Social and Political Union. She was a member of the Women's Social and Political Union up in Manchester, and she gave a couple of talks for them, 1908 to 1912 or something like that. So she was very much involved, but she was so little. I don't even think she was this tall. She was 4 feet 11. She had to stand on a box so that she could reach the other side of the table when she was unwrapping Knumnecht. So she did what she could. Yeah. I'm a big fan of hers. I know we're not supposed to have favorites, but I do. Anything else?
More questions?
I was curious if, I think that in the Amelia Peabody novels, did she do a conglomerate of some of these women, or is she based on a particular Egyptologist?
I actually wrote an article about that. And I think she was a conglomeration of a lot. I think she had, Amelia, so the question is, did Elizabeth Peters base Amelia Peabody on any of the women from this book? And I would say yes. If you've never read Amelia Peabody novels, read them. They are amazing. I would say some of her main ones, I mean, obviously Amelia Edwards, right, namesake of Amelia. I think Hilda Petrie is a lot in there. just because of her toughness.
Petrie was supposed to be Emerson, right?
Yeah, that was. There's a lot of Petrie in Emerson, except the bad stuff. You know what I mean? Because Emerson is a hero. We all know that. So I'd say Hilda Petrie, Amelia Edwards. I would definitely say some Margaret Murray because of her just Egyptological training. Probably Maggie Benson is in there too. I would say a lot because Barbara Mertz had her PhD from the University of Chicago. She knew these women, right? She knew all about these women. She did all of the research. Like, these books are solid. They're fictionalized accounts, but they are solid accounts of an excavation season with some murder, put in there. And escaping the master criminal. I think she did. I really think she did. It's a great question. Yes?
So I'm brand new to this field, so this may be an informed question. So you're getting journals, you're getting letters, you're getting autobiographies. Were women trying to publish scientifically and being thwarted, or were they like, this is not available to us?
So the question is, were women publishing scientifically, or were they not able to, or was it not available? Caroline Ransom Williams published several articles with the Metropolitan Museum of Art Bulletin, which is sort of their in-house, but it's available. It sort of gets spread around. She published dozens of articles in there. Two main books, the Tomb of Perneb, and then a translation of a stela of Mentu Woser that's still on display at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Those were her two main books, and they sold wildly well. Margaret Murray published site reports in Egyptology from from Abydos, and from her second field season at Saqqara. Maggie Benson published that one article, the one book with Nettie Gourlay, and Nettie Gourlay actually published an article with another Egyptologist a little bit later. So they were able to publish, just not as much because their roles were much more administrative. And we know, right, with administrative duties, you cannot do the publishing that you need to do or that you want to do because you have to sit down and actually write it. So what they very often did is they took on a lot of those administrative duties, so the men had time to sit down and write. Margaret Murray would unpack all the exhibit stuff, put on the exhibit for Petrie, while Petrie was off in a room writing all of his site reports. And I mean, he was a prolific publisher of site reports, and everybody loves him for that. But very few people are going, how did he do that? Because wasn't he putting on annual exhibits, and wasn't he digging every October to April, and who was doing all of the teaching, and who was doing all of this other work? It was the women. So they were, that was a long way to say they were, but just not as much as some of the men. In fact, when Herbert Winlock died a very early death from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and he had worked with Caroline Ransom, when he died, she wrote to the person who came after, who I don't remember who that was, and he wrote back to her, and he was just like, Winlock hardly published anything. Like, he was waiting to publish all this stuff. He's got boxes and trunks full of writings, and he didn't do it. And he always wondered how you did so much when he couldn't get anything out. And it's like, well, okay. So he hardly published anything, but he's a fairly famous figure in Egyptology, whereas Caroline Ransom was publishing a ton, and we're just now seeing her value. Yeah, that's a really good question. Yes.
Would you consider Phoebe Hearst for an honorable mention for her funding of Reisner?
Yeah, so the question is about Phoebe Hearst and her funding of Reisner. Yes, absolutely. Reisner was just a little bit too late for what I was looking at. And I didn't know a whole lot about him. And I had tweeted a few years ago, I said, who's doing Reisner's biography, people? And everyone was like, Peter Dermanwalian, just wait, just give him time, it's coming. And it did, and of course it's comprehensive and fantastic. So yes, Phoebe Hearst for sure. Because I know she did go to Egypt. And she painted, I believe, didn't she? And didn't she like sell some of her paintings?
As far as I know, there's not a good biography of her.
Okay.
So I don't know if she painted. I've seen the pictures of her in Egypt.
Yeah.
But she did tons of stuff.
Oh, she sure did. Yeah.
Unfortunately, her letters have been destroyed. So that's probably why there's not a big biography. They went to her childhood home, which is a museum in the Midwest someplace, and that museum lost the letters.
What the? How do you do that?
Well, was told to me by the bankrupt, which wanted them very much. And,
Yeah, CTP wants them.
yeah, and but they're as far as anybody knows, they're gone.
See, and that's the thing.
Buzzkill.
Well, it's not your fault. You didn't throw them away. No, I mean, that's the thing, right? We have these extremely important women like Phoebe Hearst, and we lose her letters, or we quote unquote lose her letters. We have nothing on Emma Andrews except for her diaries. There are a couple of letters in the Griffith Institute, and that's it.
Well, you wonder why the bank, or whoever at Berkeley didn't fight harder, because if somebody had said, sorry, we want Hiram Johnson's letters, it would be, the bankrupt would have said tough beans.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's just a pervasive thing.
Yes, yeah.
But I wanted to ask you about something that you say in the very beginning of your book, which is that part of the reason why these women have been submerged is the way that Egyptology has been allowed to be defined.
Mm-hmm.
And, the Egyptologist is this adventurer who goes out in the dangerous heat, although it's the Kuptis who are actually doing the work, and theorizes and, plans, and all the people who form the administrative framework, who actually give the money, they're not and who are the, registrars and what have you. Though everybody else is not in Egyptology, only these heroic figures. And I wonder, you have an anthro background, is that true of other, is that true of classics? Is that true of,
Yeah, so the question is, in the book, I talk about how Egyptology is defined as like heroic, dirty field work, and does that ring true for other field disciplines? Yeah, I mean, a short answer, I would say yes. A longer answer, which I was going to give, is that we understand that where knowledge is created for field sciences is in the field. For Egyptology, that's what we call at the trowel's edge, right? Where we're sort of digging up the stuff. So, yeah, if you are doing that work and you are at the trowel's edge, well, who was that? In the 19th and early 20th century, that was not the white guys, right? Those were the Egyptians, but they took that knowledge and they claimed it as their own. But it was not really women until, of course, you have like Maggie Benson and Nettie Gourlay. So, for field sciences, that's really where we prioritize that knowledge creation. But I want to shift that. I want to say, so we pull these things out of the ground. That's great. But what about the theorizing that takes place on a hotel terrace? What about the theorizing that takes place back in the museum when Mary Jonas is pulling out these pieces at the EES and she's going, oh, they missed this really crucial detail in the field. It's not on the card. I wonder if they even noticed it. I'm going to write it in and let them know that they missed that. So there are loads of places where knowledge is created along the way in Egyptology, and I think we need to look at all of those places and not just in the field. Yeah, no, thank you. That was a great question.